Welcome to Nightward Echo, a place where the night never sleeps, and every echo carries a story you were never meant to hear. Tonight, we're walking past the iron gates of the dead, into the shadows of forgotten graves and whispering tombs. These are 10 true cemetery horror stories that feel too real. Real encounters, real fear. From people who swear the dead still move beneath the soil. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Don't forget to subscribe, because once the echoes reach you, there's no turning back. They say the old caretaker still walks those graves even though he was buried in one of them 20 years ago. What the new worker found inside the tool shed one foggy morning still haunts the small town of Coldwater. I started working at Coldwater Cemetery in the spring of 2022. It wasn't exactly a dream job, but after being laid off from the factory, I needed something steady. The town's Parks and Grounds department posted an opening for a seasonal caretaker. Mowing, cleaning up debris, minor repairs. Nothing glamorous, but I figured I could handle it. The cemetery sat just outside town, about a half-mile from the main road, surrounded by dense woods. It wasn't huge, but it was old. Some graves dated back to the 1800s. The wrought iron gate had rust creeping up its edges, and the sign over the entrance leaned slightly to the left. Coldwater itself was small. Everyone knew everyone, and gossip spread faster than wildfire. So when I told a few people I got the caretaker job, I expected a few jokes about ghosts or creepy nights. What I didn't expect was how serious they looked. Coldwater Cemetery? An older woman at the diner asked me, "You mean the one where old Henry worked?" I shrugged. "I guess. The one off Ridge Road." Her face changed. "You just make sure you don't go there after dark, son. And keep that shed locked." Henry Dobbs had been the cemetery's caretaker for over 30 years, according to my supervisor, Carl. Back in 2002, he'd been found dead inside the cemetery grounds, leaning against the fence near the shed. Heart attack, they said. Natural causes. But that wasn't what the locals believed. The story went that Henry had become obsessed with the cemetery, claimed he could hear whispers coming from the older graves. People said he stopped sleeping, started digging at night, muttering to himself. When he died, they buried him right there, on the edge of the property near a large oak. Some people claimed his grave moved every few years. Others said the ground above it never froze, even in winter. I didn't buy into ghost stories. I've worked night shifts before, walked home through dark streets, stayed in places that would make most people uneasy. But there was something about that place. Even in daylight, it felt watched. My first week was uneventful. The grounds were quiet, and my main job was mowing and trimming around the headstones. Every morning, I'd unlock the small wooden shed by the gate to grab tools. It smelled like damp soil and motor oil. And inside was the old equipment: rakes, fuel cans, a wheelbarrow, a few headstone brushes. But there was also a corner I avoided, a small door set low into the back wall, barely 3 feet high, secured with a heavy rusted latch. Carl told me it led to an old storage crawl space where Henry used to keep extra stuff, but it wasn't used anymore. "Don't mess with it," he said. "It's unstable down there. Might collapse," so I didn't. For the first few days, it started with small things. The first time I thought I'd left the mower's gas cap loose, but it was missing entirely the next morning. Found it lying on one of the older graves halfway across the cemetery. Then the door to the shed started swinging open, even when I'd latched it. I assumed it was the wind until I found muddy footprints just inside. Too small for mine. Once I came in early, around 6 a.m., and swore I saw someone moving near the far edge of the grounds, near Henry's grave. I yelled out, thinking it might be kids messing around, but the figure just sort of faded into the mist. When I told Carl, he gave me a look I'll never forget. "Henry used to talk about seeing people too," he said quietly. Before he died. By mid-April, things had gotten worse. I started hearing faint noises, the sound of digging, faint and rhythmic, somewhere in the dark before sunrise. I'd shine my flashlight across the rows of headstones, but there was never anyone there. One morning, when I went to fill the mower tank, I noticed the crawl space latch was open, just hanging loose. The padlock, in which I'd never touched in, was gone. Inside was total darkness. A cold, damp air drifted out, carrying that smell of wet earth. I crouched down, shined my light in, and saw what looked like a narrow tunnel leading down into the ground. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been a tunnel there. Carl said it was just a shallow crawl space, but this looked dug out, like someone had been expanding it recently. I thought about reporting it, but part of me didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I just shut the latch and told myself I'd check it later. That night, I dreamed I was standing in the cemetery. The fog was thick, curling around the stones, and someone was whispering my name. I turned toward the oak near the fence, and Henry Dobbs was standing there, face pale and half covered in dirt. He said, "You left the door open." I woke up sweating, heart pounding. When I got to work the next morning, the shed door was wide open again, and this time, the light was on inside. Carl hadn't been there, and I knew no one else had a key. I stepped in carefully, trying to convince myself it was just some vandal or a prank. But everything inside was different. The tools were neatly arranged along the wall, much neater than I'd ever kept them. The mower had been cleaned. The floor swept, and there were fresh footprints, muddy, bare footprints, leading from the crawlspace door toward the back of the shed. I backed out slowly and called Carl. He told me to lock up and head home, that he'd come by later to check it himself. That evening, he called me back. "There's nothing here," he said. "Everything's locked up tight." I didn't tell him about the footprints. I almost quit that night. But I convinced myself it was just exhaustion. Maybe I'd imagined more than I thought. 2 days later, I decided to seal the crawlspace myself. I brought a few bricks and a bag of cement from home, figuring I'd just patch over the opening. I opened the latch again, trying not to breathe in that wet smell. When I shined my flashlight down, something caught the light. Metal. It looked like a shovel, old and rusted. I reached in to grab it, but it wouldn't budge, like it was stuck in the dirt. I pulled harder, and the soil around it crumbled away. That's when I saw what was holding it. A hand, grayish and bloated, gripping the handle tight. I fell backward, hitting my head on the wall. When I looked again, the hand was gone, just dirt, like it had never been there. I sealed the crawlspace that same afternoon. A week went by without incident. The shed stayed locked, no more missing tools, no more noises. I almost convinced myself the whole thing was just stress. Then Carl called. "You been by the cemetery today?" I told him no, it was my day off. "Someone dug up a grave last night," he said, "near the oak tree. Henry Dobbs's grave." When I got there, the police were already investigating. The coffin had been disturbed, not fully unearthed, but the ground was torn up like someone had been clawing at it from the inside. One of the officers asked me if there were animals that could do that. I said no, not like this. When they left, I noticed something half buried near the headstone. A small brass tag. I wiped it off and realized what it was, a nameplate from a uniform. It read, H. Dobbs. The next morning, I went to the shed one last time. The cement I'd laid over the crawl space had cracked clean down the center. The padlock on the outer door was hanging loose again. Inside, everything smelled like wet dirt. There was a single muddy footprint in the middle of the floor, and next to it, a shovel and freshly cleaned. I quit that same day. I moved 2 towns over, took a warehouse job, and haven't gone back since. But last month, someone posted on a local Facebook group. They said the new caretaker of Coldwater Cemetery heard digging one night, found the shed door open in the morning. The comment ended with one line: "He must have forgotten to lock it again." I grew up in St. Martinville, Louisiana, a quiet, humid little town where nothing much happens unless you count ghost stories. Every small town has them, right? But around here, everyone knew one in particular. Never play near St. Martin Cemetery after dark. It was one of those old, sprawling cemeteries you see in movies, wrought iron gates, tilted gravestones, and marble angels that look like they've been crying for decades. The air always felt thicker there, like the swamp mist just refused to leave. My mom used to drive past it on the way to my aunt's place, and every time she'd make the sign of the cross. She said she knew a man who went in there once after midnight and came back wrong. She wouldn't say what that meant. I never believed in that kind of stuff growing up. Ghost stories were just stories. But that changed one summer night when my best friend Aaron and I decided to prove everyone wrong. It was July, and the air was sticky and full of mosquitoes. We were 17, bored, restless, and trying to look braver than we really were. My girlfriend at the time, Jenna, came along too. She wasn't from around here and didn't grow up with all the creepy local warnings. So she laughed when we told her the stories. The plan was simple. We'd sneak into the cemetery after dark, walk around, maybe take a few pictures and post them online to debunk the myth. Aaron brought a flashlight, I brought my phone, and Jenna brought her usual confidence, the kind that made both of us do things we shouldn't. We parked Aaron's old truck a block away and cut across the grass toward the gate. The cemetery was bigger than I remembered. Beyond the entrance, the ground dipped slightly and rows of cracked headstones stretched out in every direction. Spanish moss hung from the trees like old curtains, and somewhere in the distance, a frog croaked loud enough to make Jenna jump. Creepy, but not that bad, Aaron whispered. We walked deeper in, laughing quietly and teasing each other about who would chicken out first. I remember the sound of our footsteps on the gravel, the low hum of crickets, and how unnaturally still everything else felt. Then, we saw her. She was kneeling by a headstone about 50 feet away, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Long black hair, white dress. She wasn't moving much, just kind of rocking slightly, her head bowed. At first, I thought maybe she was visiting a grave, but at midnight, and alone? "Hey, kid!" Aaron called out, his voice a little uncertain. The girl didn't look up. "Maybe she didn't hear you," Jenna whispered. Aaron started walking toward her, but the closer we got, the more wrong it felt. Her hair wasn't shiny or full like normal hair. It was stringy and flat, almost like it was still wet. And that white dress, it looked off, like it had been washed too many times, the color faded and gray near the hem. I raised my phone to use the flashlight. The second the light hit her, she froze. Not slowly, completely, like someone pressed pause on her body. Then she turned her head just enough for us to see her face. Her eyes were pitch black. Not dark brown, black like the color had been drained out of them. And her skin looked pale and slick, as if she'd been standing out in the rain, though it hadn't rained in days. We all stopped. No one spoke. She turned back toward the headstone and started whispering again, low, fast, like she was talking to someone. "Let's go," Jenna hissed. "Seriously. Let's go." Aaron didn't move. "Maybe she needs help." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. She's not right." The girl's whispering suddenly stopped. Then, without standing, she pointed one thin, shaking finger at us. Something behind us moved. It was faint at first, just a soft crunch of gravel somewhere over our shoulders. Then another. Aaron swung the flashlight around. Nothing, but the sound kept getting closer, circling us. The beam flickered, and for a split second I swear I saw a hand, pale, reaching up from behind a tombstone. Aaron dropped the flashlight. The light hit the ground and spun wildly, making the shadows around us twist and shift like they were alive. The girl started to laugh. Not loud, not childlike. A dry, hollow laugh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep in her chest. I grabbed Jenna's hand and ran. Aaron was right behind us. We bolted through the maze of graves, tripping on the uneven ground. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear something. Footsteps that didn't match ours, dragging sounds. Faint whispering that didn't belong to any of us. We finally burst out through the gate and didn't stop running until we reached the truck. Aaron fumbled with the keys, started it, and tore out of there. None of us said a word the whole way home. The next morning, Aaron texted me that he'd gone back to look for the flashlight. It was his dad's, and he didn't want to get in trouble. I told him not to. He didn't listen. He came back pale and quiet, said he couldn't find it. But he'd found something else. 3 small footprints in the dirt leading up to one of the headstones. The name on it was Lydia Marie Thibodeau, died in 1919, age 9, a little girl. He showed me a photo he'd taken of the grave. I swear I could see something faint in the picture, like the corner of a white dress just barely visible behind the stone. Things got weird after that. Aaron started having nightmares, said he could hear someone whispering his name at night. Jenna and I broke up a few weeks later. She wouldn't talk about what we saw, said just thinking about it made her feel sick. As for me, I thought I was fine. Until a few months later, when I was driving past the cemetery one evening. It was right at sunset, and for a moment I looked through the gates. There, standing by the same headstone, was that little girl in white. Same still posture, same long black hair. But this time, she was facing the road, and when I drove past, her head turned, slow and deliberate, following my car until I couldn't see her anymore. I've moved away from Louisiana since then. Haven't been back in years, but sometimes on quiet nights I still hear that whispering. It doesn't say words, Just soft, wet sounds like someone praying under their breath. And every now and then I'll wake up to find damp footprints near my window. Small ones barefoot. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that it's impossible, but deep down I know what I saw in that cemetery was real, and whatever that girl was whispering to that night, it hurt us too. I grew up in a small, quiet town called Maple Hollow, just a few miles outside Evergreen Cemetery. Everyone in town knew the stories about that place. Kids would dare each other to jump the stone wall at night, touch the old chapel door, or sit by the iron gate until midnight to hear the bell. I used to laugh at those stories, until I moved into the house right across from that cemetery. It was early October last year. I'd just gotten divorced and was looking for somewhere quiet, cheap, where I could start over. The real estate agent, an older lady named June, told me the house on Pine Road was cozy and rich with history. That should have been my first red flag. The house itself wasn't bad, small but clean. It sat on a slight hill, with a perfect view of Evergreen's crooked headstones and the dark outline of the chapel at its center. The chapel was a tiny stone building with a pointed roof and a rusted bell tower that had long since collapsed. June mentioned that it had been decommissioned in the 1980s, after a fire and some vandalism. No one had used it since, but she didn't mention the bell. The first night, I unpacked most of my things and sat by the window, staring out at the fog that rolled through the cemetery. It was peaceful in a creepy sort of way. Around midnight, I shut off the lights and went to bed. Then just as I was drifting off, ding. A single, clear bell tone rang out through the night. I remember sitting up instantly. It wasn't faint or far away, it was close, like it had come from right outside. I looked at the clock, 12:07 a.m. I stared out the window for a good 5 minutes, waiting for another sound. But there was nothing, just silence and fog. The next morning, I asked my neighbor, Carl, a retired mailman who lived 2 houses down, if he'd ever heard it. He nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting that question. "Yeah," he said. "That'd be the bell." "What bell?" I asked. "The Evergreen bell," he said, lowering his voice. "Rings every night at 12:07. Been doing it for decades. Ain't no one ever found where it's coming from." He told me the story, or at least the version people in town believed. Back in the 1950s, the cemetery's caretaker, a man named Thomas Hale, lived in a small house right beside the chapel. He was known to ring the chapel bell every night to signal the cemetery's closing. But one night he didn't come home. They found him the next morning inside the chapel, dead from a heart attack, kneeling beside the altar. The next night, the bell rang again, and it kept ringing, even after the church stopped operating, even after the fire. People started saying it was Thomas Hale still doing his nightly duty. Carl shrugged and said, "Most folks just ignore it now. Don't go looking for it. That's what keeps it quiet." For the first few nights, I tried to ignore it too, but I couldn't help noticing how precise it was. Always 12:07, always one clear tone. Sometimes I'd be awake waiting for it, and I'd still jump when I heard it. By the 4th night, curiosity got the better of me. I stayed up, watching the cemetery through my window. Q6 came. The fog rolled in thicker than usual, swallowing the gravestones one by one. Then at 12:07 exactly, and ding. This time I swear I saw movement by the chapel. A faint shadow crossed in front of the broken doorway just for a second. I thought it might have been an animal, but the way it moved, slow, deliberate, it looked human. I decided to go check it out. I grabbed my jacket, flashlight, and phone, and crossed the street. The gate creaked open with a long metallic groan echoing into the fog. The air felt different inside, colder, heavier. By the time I reached the chapel, my breath was visible. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. I shined my light through the doorway. The place was gutted, charred wood beams, old pews collapsed into ash and rot. There was no roof left, just the skeletal frame of the tower. And then I saw it, a rope dangling from the ceiling. It looked new, clean, unburned, out of place. I reached up to touch it, but before I could, ding. The sound blasted right above me. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw someone. A tall figure standing by the altar facing the wall. Then it was gone. I bolted out of there, heart pounding, and didn't look back until I was across the street again. The next morning, I told Carl what I'd seen. He just shook his head. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said. "That's how folks disappear." He told me about a group of teenagers in the late 90s who'd tried the same thing. They'd gone into the chapel to record the bell for a school project. The next morning, their car was still parked outside the gate. None of them were ever found. The police assumed they'd run away, but the locals didn't. That night, I taped my windows shut and turned up the TV. Still, at 12:07, I heard it, louder this time, like it was inside the house. I turned the TV off. Silence. Then, ding. The sound came from the hallway. I froze. Every instinct told me not to move, but after a few seconds, I forced myself to look. The hallway was empty, but the front door was wide open. I ran to it and slammed it shut. I locked it, chained it, even shoved a chair under the handle. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called the real estate agent and demanded answers. June sounded nervous and too quick to deflect. She finally admitted the house had been empty for over a decade before I moved in. The previous owner, a man named Henry Briggs, had gone missing under strange circumstances. Apparently, he'd been a local historian obsessed with Evergreen Cemetery. His neighbors said he used to visit the chapel every night with a tape recorder, trying to catch the bell ringer. The night he vanished? October 12th, the last recording on his tape, a single bell at 12:07 a.m. I tried to leave after that. Packed my car, drove toward the interstate, but the road was blocked. A fallen tree, massive, fresh, covering both lanes. I turned back, figuring I'd try in the morning. At 11:50 p.m., I started hearing it early. Faint bells in the distance, like someone testing the sound. Then footsteps. Slow, steady, coming down my porch steps. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The clock hit 12:07 ding. The sound wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was right above me. I looked up and saw a shadow through the ceiling vent. A long, thin shape swaying slightly like a rope. That was 3 nights ago. I'm writing this from a motel 2 towns over. I left everything behind, the house, the car, all of it. But last night at exactly 12:07 a.m., I heard it again. A single clear bell tone coming from the woods behind this motel. And when I looked out the window, through the trees, faint and distant, I swear I saw the outline of a small stone chapel, and something moving inside. A true account, or at least that's what I keep telling myself. I've been doing amateur ghost hunting for almost 7 years now. Nothing professional, just me and my best friend Ethan driving around Nevada chasing local legends. We never found anything truly convincing. No floating orbs, no phantom figures, just creaking wood, bad camera lighting, and the occasional raccoon scare. But last March, something happened in a small town called Carson Hills, just outside Reno, that changed the way I look at everything. I've stopped going on hunts since that night. Ethan doesn't talk about it at all anymore, and after what we found there, I don't think anyone should. The Hook, the cemetery with no history. We found Carson Hills Cemetery on an old blog about forgotten graveyards in Nevada. It wasn't on Google Maps. It was described as a resting place that doesn't exist on any official record. The photos showed maybe 30 gravestones, all cracked or faded, surrounded by desert brush and half-collapsed fences. It looked abandoned for decades, exactly the kind of place we loved filming. We packed our cameras, mix a thermal cam and my old Canon DSLR. The plan was to film overnight for a short, forgotten cemetery video. It was early spring, cold with that dry wind that whistles through dead grass. Carson Hills itself was barely a town, a gas station, a bar, a few trailers, and a post office that hadn't been open in years. When we asked a local about the cemetery, an old guy at the bar just said, "You mean that hill? Ain't no one buried there that wants visitors." I thought it was just small-town superstition, but the way he said it, like he wasn't joking, put something cold in my chest. The build-up. The fresh grave we hiked up around 7 p.m. The sun was just sinking, painting the sky orange behind the mountains. The graveyard sat on a slope, fenced with rusted wire and an old metal gate that squealed when we opened it. At first, it was just eerie in the way all old graveyards are. Quiet, dry air, crickets in the brush. But after a few minutes, Ethan called me over. "Dude," he said, pointing his flashlight down, "this one's fresh." And he wasn't wrong. It was an open grave, rectangular, clean-cut, maybe 6 feet deep, with a mound of loose dirt beside it. The soil was darker than the rest, moist even, like it had been dug recently. There was no coffin, no marker, no tools, nothing. I remember shining my flashlight into it, expecting to see a casket or at least some kind of wood planks. But it was empty. Ethan laughed nervously. "Maybe they're still working on it?" "By who?" I said. "No one even maintains this place. We started filming." The footage starts normal, us joking, exploring, trying to keep things light. But you can see when the tone shifts. At one point, the camera catches a weird hollow sound like something knocking from deep underground. We thought it was our imagination. Wind, maybe. But later that night, we realized it wasn't. Midnight at Carson Hills, we set up 2 static cameras facing the open grave, and then we walked around filming headstones. Some dated back to the late 1800s. The names were barely legible. Around 11:30, Ethan said he kept hearing something like shifting dirt. We paused to listen, and sure enough, there was a sound. Subtle, like someone slowly moving beneath loose soil, not constant. Just short bursts, then silence. I told him it was probably small animals burrowing, but my voice didn't sound convincing even to myself. By midnight, the wind had died completely. The whole place felt too still, the kind of quiet that makes your heartbeat sound loud in your own ears. Then, around 12:40, one of the static cameras started glitching. It flickered and cut out. We walked back to check it, and the open grave looked different. The mound of dirt beside it was smaller, like some of it had fallen in, except it hadn't fallen down. It looked like it had been pulled in. I told Ethan not to touch anything until we checked the playback later. But he crouched down anyway, shining his flashlight into the grave. That's when he froze. "There's something moving down there," he whispered. The climax. What the camera caught, I leaned in beside him, holding the camera. At first, I didn't see it. Just loose soil, shifting like air pressure was changing underneath. Then, something pushed up. Not a full hand, not like in horror movies. Just a shape pale and soft, pressing through the dirt, then sinking back down. We bolted. We grabbed the gear, sprinted to the car, and drove back down the dirt road without saying a word. When we finally stopped at the motel in Carson City around 2 a.m., we went through the footage frame by frame, the static camera that had glitched. It caught everything. At 12:37 a.m., the grave starts trembling. Dirt begins sliding inward like something shifting underneath. Then, slowly, a pale shape starts rising. It's hard to make out, but it looks like shoulders, then a head. It crawls out on all fours, skin like wax covered in dust. It doesn't look human. It's too long, too thin. It moves with jerky, unnatural motions, like someone trying to remember how to crawl. The figure drags itself halfway out of the grave, then stops and turns its head toward the camera. And that's when the camera dies. No sound. No jump scare. Just static. The resolution, the return. We deleted the video that night. Neither of us could stand watching it again. Ethan wanted to burn the SD card, but I kept it. Maybe part of me didn't want to believe what we saw was real. About 2 weeks later, he called me. His voice was shaky. He said he went back to Carson Hills to see if the grave was still there. When he got there, the grave was filled in. But here's the part that messed him up. There was a new, unmarked headstone beside it. And carved faintly into the surface were 3 words. "You filmed me." Ethan hasn't spoken to me since that day. He moved out of state, deleted all our ghost hunting accounts, wiped his hard drives, sold his cameras. As for me, sometimes I still hear the sound of shifting dirt when I'm trying to sleep. And last week, I found something buried behind my shed. A small old gravestone, no name. Just the same 3 words carved faintly into the stone, like someone had taken a nail and scratched them in. "You filmed me." I don't go out at night anymore, and I'll never ever go ghost hunting again. I work nights as a groundskeeper for a small old cemetery just outside Gainesville, Florida. The place is called Pine Hollow Memorial, but the locals have always called it Dead Man's Bend. It's tucked behind a stretch of road that floods every hurricane season, surrounded by thick oak trees and Spanish moss that droops low enough to brush your windshield. I've been there almost 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of weird stuff. Shadows that look like people, flowers rearranged in the morning, lights flickering in mausoleums where there's no electricity. But what happened last August still keeps me from sleeping soundly. It started like any other muggy night. The air was heavy, the bugs were loud, and my flashlight beam cut through a slow, creeping fog that always seemed to gather around the oldest part of the graveyard, the section where the names had worn off the headstones. I was doing my rounds, checking for vandalism and making sure the gates were locked. I'd usually smoke a cigarette or two while walking the perimeter, but that night something felt off. The sound came first. It was faint, like someone knocking softly on wood. I stopped walking and listened. At first I thought it might be a woodpecker, but it was too rhythmic. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Then silence. It came from the far end of the cemetery near the Braddock family mausoleum. Now that place has been sealed for decades. It's a tall stone crypt built in the early 1900s, with a big iron gate welded shut and a granite door that hasn't been opened in my lifetime. Inside are the remains of the Braddock family, a wealthy clan who died out generations ago. The locals say the last Braddock died mysteriously in 1954. Nobody really talks about them anymore. I headed that way, flashlight shaking a little as I walked. The closer I got, the clearer the sound became. Knock, 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 then a pause. Knock, knock, knock. I swear it was coming from inside the mausoleum. Hello? I called out, even though my voice cracked a little.
Anyone there?
No answer. I shined my flashlight on the door. Solid stone. No cracks big enough for an animal to crawl through. The iron gate was still welded tight. Then, just as I leaned closer, something hit the inside of the door, hard enough that I felt it through the ground. It was a single, heavy thud that made my heart jump into my throat. I ran back to my shed and called the sheriff's office. I knew how crazy it sounded. I heard knocking from inside a tomb, but the dispatcher must have recognized my voice because she sent someone anyway. Sheriff Daniels showed up about 20 minutes later, his cruiser lights flashing against the tombstones. "What's going on, Mark?" he asked. I told him everything. The knocking, the thud, the fact that the mausoleum had been sealed for decades. He gave me that half smile people give when they think you're spooked over nothing. But when I offered to show him, he agreed. When we got back to the Braddock tomb, the air felt colder somehow. The fog had thickened. I noticed the birds had gone silent. Daniels went up to the gate, tugged on it, and frowned. "Looks solid," he said. But then he froze. The stone door was open. It wasn't all the way open, just slightly ajar, enough that you could see the blackness inside. The iron gate, the one that had been welded shut since before I was born, was hanging loose. The welds snapped like brittle plastic. Daniels turned to me. "You said it was sealed?" "I swear it was," I said. "I check this place every week. It's never been open." He drew his flashlight and stepped inside. I didn't want to follow, but I couldn't let him go in alone. The air inside was damp and cold, and it smelled like wet earth and old stone. The beam from my flashlight caught 6 marble coffins lining the walls, 3 on each side. Each had a brass plaque with a name, but every single one of the lids had been moved. Not off completely, just slid enough that the insides were visible. Empty. Daniels cursed under his breath and radioed for backup. "All the coffins are empty," he said into the mic. "Looks like grave tampering." He told me to wait outside while he did a sweep of the interior. I stood there, pacing near the door, trying to wrap my head around what we were seeing. There were no signs of forced entry. No tools, no footprints, nothing disturbed except the door itself. Then I heard Daniels yell. It wasn't a shout for help, more like a startled bark. I ran in, flashlight shaking, and found him standing near the back wall, breathing heavy. He pointed at something carved into the stone. It was a fresh message scratched into the granite with something sharp. The letters were uneven, shaky, and covered in a thin layer of dust. It said, "Let us out again." Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then behind us we heard something, a whisper, low and wet, like air being pushed through a narrow space. I turned my flashlight toward the entrance, but there was nothing there. The light flickered once, then died. Daniel's flashlight went out too. We stood in pitch darkness, hearing that sound again, closer this time. A soft dragging noise, like something heavy moving across stone. "Move," Daniel shouted, grabbing my arm. We ran for the exit, tripping over the threshold and stumbling into the cold air outside. When I turned back, the door had swung shut on its own. We tried to open it again, but it wouldn't budge. Daniels called for more units, but when they arrived an hour later, the mausoleum was sealed again, tighter than before. They brought in a crew to inspect it the next morning. That's when things got weirder. There were no tool marks, no signs the welds had ever been broken. The door looked untouched, as if it had never been opened at all. And the scratches on the wall? Gone, just smooth stone. The sheriff didn't file a report. He told me it was probably a trick of the light, that maybe vandals had been there earlier and we just scared ourselves. But I know what I saw. We both do. I quit that job 2 weeks later. I still drive by Pine Hollow sometimes, though, just out of habit. The Braddock Mausoleum sits near the top of a small hill, right where the trees thin out. Last week, I slowed down at night to look at it one last time. My headlights passed over the stone front, and for half a second I swear I saw movement. Not behind the gate, but inside the narrow gap of the door, like someone standing just past the edge of the darkness, watching. I don't go near there anymore, but 2 nights ago my phone buzzed. Unknown number. The voicemail was nothing but faint static, followed by 3 clear knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence. I don't really believe in ghosts. I never have. At least I didn't until last year when I took that photograph. It started on a gray Sunday afternoon in October, the kind of day where everything feels heavy and slow. My grandmother, Margaret Lewis, had passed away a few months before. She was 91, sharp as ever until the end. I grew up with her, she practically raised me. And even after she was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still around somehow. She was buried in a small place called Rosewood Cemetery, just outside of Denton, Texas. It's a quiet, rural patch of land surrounded by barbed wire fences and tall, crooked oaks. The ground dips in odd places, and half the graves date back to the 1800s. Some of the stones lean so far you'd think they were being pulled underground. I drove out there alone. My mom and sister had already been earlier in the week, but I couldn't make it due to work. I told myself I just wanted to bring some flowers, a simple gesture. But part of me knew I was looking for something else. Closure, maybe, or reassurance. The air was cold that day. The kind of cold that clings to your clothes even though it's not winter yet. When I parked by the rusted gate, there was no one else around. The only sound was the low hum of wind brushing through dead grass. Her grave sat near the far end of the cemetery, marked by a clean white headstone we'd all pitched in for. It read, Margaret Lewis, 1929-2023. Beloved mother and grandmother. I knelt down, placed the bouquet, and just sat there for a while. I didn't say anything out loud, but my thoughts were racing. Regrets, memories, questions. She'd always been a spiritual person, the kind who left bowls of salt by doors and told me to never whistle indoors. It calls them, she used to say. I never asked what them meant. Before I left, I decided to take a picture. It wasn't planned. It just felt right. I took out my phone, framed the headstone against the trees, and snapped one photo. When I looked at the screen, I froze. In the reflection of the polished marble, faint but visible, there was a face behind me. A woman's face. Pale, sunken with thin gray hair falling over her forehead. She was standing a few feet back, right over my shoulder, staring directly into the lens. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe a smudge, a glare, something like that. I even wiped my camera and took another shot. This time nothing. The reflection was gone, but the first photo, it looked too real. The outline, the eyes, even the old floral pattern on the dress and the same one Grandma was buried in. I remember whispering, "No way," under my breath. My heart was pounding. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there. But the place was empty. Just graves, trees, and that cold wind. I got in my car and drove home faster than I should have. That night I showed the photo to my mom. She stared at it for a long time, then pushed the phone back toward me. Her hands were trembling. "That's her," she whispered. "That's your grandmother." Neither of us said much after that. She told me to delete it, that it wasn't right to keep something like that. I said I would, but I didn't. I couldn't. I backed it up, hidden in a folder on my laptop. The next morning I woke up to a voicemail from the cemetery caretaker. He said there'd been some vandalism overnight. My grandmother's headstone had been found cracked straight down the middle. I drove back out there, even though every part of me didn't want to. Sure enough, The grave marker was split clean through, a jagged fracture right between her first and last name. The flowers I'd left were gone. Not wilted, not blown away, gone. The caretaker, a man named Bill, said he'd never seen anything like it. "We get kids messing around sometimes," he told me, "but this looks like it's split from the inside." He laughed after saying that, but it wasn't a real laugh. More like the kind people use when they're trying to make something less terrifying. That night I started hearing things around my house. Soft knocks on the walls. The sound of footsteps on carpet when I knew I was alone. Sometimes I'd smell her perfume, a faint mix of lavender and old powder, drifting through the hallway. I told myself it was stress. Grief can do weird things to your head, but then my phone buzzed. A new notification. One photo added to your library. It was the photo, the one I'd hidden on my laptop. Except the reflection was closer now. The face behind me wasn't faint anymore. It filled almost half the image, eyes wide open. The mouth, my grandmother's mouth, was parted like she was about to say something. I dropped the phone. When I picked it up again, the screen was black. Over the next few days, my lights started flickering. The TV would turn on by itself, playing static at full volume in the middle of the night. My dog refused to go near my room. He'd just sit outside the door whining. I called my mom again, but she wouldn't talk about it. She said she'd started seeing things too, reflections in windows that didn't match her movements. "We need to leave her be," she said. "She's not ready to rest." That was the last real conversation we had about it. Eventually, I deleted the photo for good. Or at least I tried to. I wiped my phone, my laptop, my cloud backup. But every few weeks it comes back. Always the same picture. The reflection, the cracked stone, the trees in the background. Except each time her face is a little clearer. I showed it once to a friend who edits photos professionally. He said something that stuck with me ever since. He zoomed in on her eyes and said, "You know this isn't a reflection, right? The lighting's wrong. The face isn't behind you, it's in front of you." I haven't gone back to Rosewood Cemetery since, but sometimes when I look into my mirror before bed, I swear I can see her standing behind me again, just out of focus, smiling that same tired smile she used to give when she thought I wasn't listening. If you ever visit Denton and drive past a crooked little sign that says Rosewood Cemetery, keep going. Don't stop. Because some pictures aren't meant to be taken, and some goodbyes don't stay buried. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky that barely shows up on maps anymore. It's one of those places with more cows than people where everyone knows everyone, and secrets die slower than most folks. My best friend Tyler and I lived about a mile apart, both of us surrounded by endless fields, barns, and the thick green hush of the woods. When we were kids, we used to cut through those woods to get to school, and right in the middle of that path sat the old Finch Cemetery. Nobody really took care of it anymore. The grass grew knee-high and most of the headstones leaned like broken teeth. We never thought much about it. Every small town's got one of those creepy little graveyards, right? It wasn't until last fall that the place started to change. The hook-it started with a story my grandpa told us one night. He said when he was young, people would sometimes hear whispering in the cemetery after dark. Not voices exactly, more like the wind saying names. Back then they said it was the dead calling for someone. Tyler laughed when he heard that, called it backwoods ghost nonsense. But a week later he called me around midnight, whispering through the phone like a kid scared of waking his parents. "Dude," he said, "I think someone's in the cemetery." He told me he'd gone out to smoke near the fence line, something he did often, and saw a faint light moving between the graves. At first he thought it was someone with a flashlight, but then he realized the light wasn't moving like a flashlight. It flickered, soft and white like a candle flame, and he swore he could hear someone whispering his name. I told him he was probably just high or imagining things, but his voice had that tight, shaky tone you can't fake. "You don't get it," he said. "They were saying my name, man." Not like a voice from the woods. It was close, like right next to me. The build-up the next morning I went over. The air was cold, fog curling over the fields like smoke. We walked to the cemetery together. Everything looked normal. Just old forgotten graves, their crosses and slabs covered in moss. But then I noticed something strange. Some of the crosses, the iron ones stuck into the ground and had shifted. You could tell because the dirt around them was slightly disturbed, fresh. They weren't all facing the same way anymore. It was subtle, but it was there. Did they always point this direction? I asked. Tyler frowned. No, I'm sure that one used to face the other side. We looked around and realized at least half of them had turned slightly, all facing toward one particular grave at the center. The name carved into that stone had nearly worn away, but we could still make out part of it. Eleanor Fitch, 1887-1912. No one in town had mentioned her name before. No one even remembered that grave existed. We told my grandpa later that day, and for the first time in my life, I saw him go pale. He said the Fitch family was one of the old ones, the kind that came here before electricity. Eleanor Fitch was the youngest daughter. Folks said she was strange, talked to things in the woods. Some claimed she predicted deaths, even her own. They said after she died, she kept talking, my grandpa said quietly, from under the ground. The descent a few nights later, Tyler called me again, only this time he didn't sound scared. He sounded curious. He said he'd gone back and the crosses had moved even more. Every single one was now pointed directly at Eleanor's grave. It's like they're trying to tell us something, he said. I told him to stop going there, but he just laughed and hung up. By the next morning, his mom called me asking if I'd seen him. He hadn't come home. I biked down to the cemetery and found his car parked off the dirt road, half hidden behind trees. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. The fog hadn't lifted yet, and it muffled everything, even the sound of my own footsteps. When I pushed through the gates, I froze. All the crosses, maybe 50 of them, were turned at perfect angles, all facing that same grave. Every one of them. The dirt around Eleanor's stone looked freshly disturbed, and there, in front of it, lay Tyler's jacket and flashlight. The beam was still on, weak and flickering. The ground looked soft, like it had been dug up recently and then filled back in. I yelled his name until my throat burned, but the only sound that came back was the wind moving through the trees. And underneath that, barely there, and I swear I heard it, a whisper. Not my name this time. Hers, Eleanor. The climax. The police came. They dug up half the cemetery thinking maybe Tyler had fallen into a sinkhole or something. They didn't find a thing. No body, no tracks, nothing. Just that same grave and undisturbed, according to them. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. A week after the search, I went back one last time against every bit of common sense I had left. It was late, the moon slicing through the fog like a dull knife. I stood there staring at Eleanor's grave, thinking maybe I'd find some clue everyone missed. Then, something happened that I can't explain. One by one, the crosses began to turn, slowly, smoothly, like invisible hands were pushing them. Metal squealed softly in the dirt. My stomach dropped. They all pivoted until every single one, every rusted iron cross, faced directly toward me. And that's when I heard it again. That whisper. This time, it wasn't Eleanor's name, it was mine. The ending I ran until I couldn't breathe. I left Kentucky 2 days later and haven't been back since. Tyler was officially listed as a missing person. His mom still calls me sometimes just to ask if I've heard anything new. I never know what to say, but last week I got a letter. No return address, no postmark. Just my name written on the front in messy handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, taken in that same cemetery. It showed all the crosses lined up in perfect formation again. Except one. One cross had turned. Not toward Eleanor's grave this time, but toward the edge of the cemetery. Toward the trees. And standing just behind those trees, half hidden in the shadows, was someone I swear looked exactly like Tyler. You ever drive past a place that just feels wrong? Like you can't really explain it, but something about it makes your stomach twist. Like the air itself doesn't want you there. For me, that place was Ridgefield Cemetery, just outside a small Pennsylvania town called Millstone. It's not a big cemetery, just a few dozen crooked stones half swallowed by the earth, hidden behind a rusted iron fence and a single flickering streetlight that never seems to stay on for long. I used to pass it every night on my way home from work. It's tucked between the woods and a dirt road most people avoid after dark. Locals call it Lantern Hill, because every Halloween night people say they've seen a dim, flickering light moving between the graves, like an old lantern swinging gently in someone's hand. The story goes that the last gravedigger, a man named Silas Hodge, worked there until he died in 1928. Supposedly, He collapsed in the middle of the night while digging a fresh plot, and when they buried him, they placed his lantern in his hands. Ever since then, people claim to see it glowing, drifting through the fog each October 31st. I never believed it. Until last year. It started as a joke between me and my two co-workers, Andy and Sam. We all worked the late shift at a paper mill outside Millstone. Halloween night, we got off at around midnight. We were exhausted and covered in pulp dust, but Andy, being the type who always needed to push boundaries, said, "Hey, let's go see if old Silas is out there tonight." Sam groaned immediately. "Come on, man. It's cold, it's late, and I've heard enough about that creepy place since I was a kid." But Andy grinned at me. "You're not scared, are you?" I shrugged. "I'm not scared. I just don't want to waste gas chasing some ghost story." That was all the encouragement he needed. 5 minutes, Andy said. "We just drive by once, see if we spot the light, and if not, I'll buy you guys breakfast." I figured fine. A free breakfast was worth it. The road to Ridgefield was darker than usual that night. Fog clung to the trees, thick and low, and the headlights barely reached past a few yards. I was driving, Andy rode shotgun, and Sam sat in the back, silent, watching the fog roll by like smoke. When we turned the corner near the cemetery, the world just went quiet. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Even the hum of the car seemed to fade. That's when I noticed it. A faint glow barely visible through the mist. It was deep inside the graveyard, near the oldest section. A small warm flicker like a lantern being carried through the fog. Andy leaned forward. "Dude, that's it." "That's it." I slowed down, pulling the car to the shoulder. The light swayed slowly between the graves, disappearing behind headstones, then reappearing again, closer each time. Sam whispered, "It's probably a caretaker or something." "Caretaker?" Andy laughed quietly. "No one's worked here in decades. The town can barely afford to fix potholes." And then, as if to prove him wrong, the lantern light stopped moving. It hovered between two trees, just hanging there, motionless. We sat there for maybe a full minute, no one saying a word. Then Andy got out. "Man, what are you doing?" I hissed. "Relax," he said. "I just want to see what it is." He started walking toward the fence, crunching through the gravel. The air was so thick with fog that the beam of my headlights looked like solid white walls. Sam muttered, "We shouldn't be here." Seriously. But I stayed. I couldn't explain it. I felt glued to the seat, like if I moved, I'd break some unspoken rule. Andy stopped by the gate and shone his phone's flashlight. "See? It's just..." The light blinked out, both the lantern and his phone, gone in the same instant. "Andy?" I called. Nothing. Sam started panicking, reaching for the door handle. "We have to go get him." Before I could respond, the lantern light came back, but this time it wasn't standing still. It was moving fast, gliding along the ground, weaving between tombstones straight toward Andy. And I swear, I saw something behind that light. A shape, tall and hunched, dragging something along the dirt. Andy screamed. Just one short, sharp sound, and then silence. The lantern blinked out again. I jumped out of the car, yelling his name. The fog swallowed my voice like cotton. I ran to the fence, and there was nothing. No Andy, no light. Just rows of tilted stones and wet grass. Then Sam shouted from the car, "Get back in!" When I turned, I saw it. There was movement on the other side of the fence, not a person but something crawling along the ground, dragging itself through the mud. Its arms, if that's what it was, ended in a shape like an old metal hook or handle, and it scraped the earth as it moved. Something clanked like a chain being pulled, and then that dim, golden glow rose again, shining faintly from where Andy had been standing. The lantern, it was swinging from a skeletal hand, the flame inside flickering weakly, reflecting off the cracked glass. And right beneath it, I saw something glint. Andy's phone, half buried in the dirt. That's when I finally moved. I ran back to the car, slammed the door, and peeled out so fast the tires kicked up gravel. Sam was screaming the whole time. Not words, just sounds. We didn't stop until we hit the main road. We went to the police that night. They searched the area the next morning, but they didn't find Andy. Just his phone, dead and covered in mud. No footprints, no signs of a struggle. They wrote it off as a missing person case. But a few days later, a local paper ran a tiny story about vandals seen around Ridgefield Cemetery. They'd gone in during the day and found something strange. A new grave. Freshly dug. No marker, no name. Just a wooden stake with a rusted lantern hanging from it. The police didn't connect it to Andy, but Sam and I knew better. I stopped working the night shift after that. Sam quit the mill entirely and moved to Scranton. We barely talk now, and when we do, we never mention that night. But sometimes on my way home, I still take the long road past Ridgefield. I tell myself I just want closure, that maybe I'll see Andy walking out of the fog, smiling and telling me it was all a prank gone too far. But every Halloween since then, I've noticed it, that same flicker between the graves, that faint glow that seems to follow my car as I drive by. And this year, it looks a little brighter, almost like there's more than one lantern now. I used to volunteer at a small church cemetery just outside of Salem, Oregon. It wasn't much, just a few acres of old headstones surrounded by misty pine trees and a rusted black gate that always seemed to groan when you opened it. Most days I helped with trimming grass, clearing leaves, that kind of stuff. It was peaceful work, the kind of silence that makes you think. But that peace ended when the boy showed up. His name was Jonah. I didn't know that until later, but I remember the first time I saw him. It was late autumn, around November, when the fog sat heavy over the ground like a blanket. I was unlocking the gate one morning and there he was, sitting on the chapel steps with a rolled-up sleeping bag beside him. He couldn't have been older than 14, maybe 15. His face was pale, thin, and his clothes looked like they'd been slept in for weeks. "Hey, you can't stay here," I told him. I wasn't trying to be mean, just matter of fact. But he didn't move. He just looked up at me with this tired, empty stare. "It's warm inside," he said quietly. "The chapel, I mean." I didn't even know he had a key, or maybe the old wooden door had been left unlocked. I didn't push it further. The kid clearly had nowhere else to go. I figured I'd let him stay one night, maybe talk to the pastor about it later. That one night turned into a week. Every morning, I'd find his sleeping bag tucked neatly in the back corner of the chapel, beside a shelf of old hymnals and melted candle stubs. He never stole anything, never made a mess. He just stayed there, like part of the building itself. When I'd bring him food, sandwiches or a thermos of soup, he'd say thank you but barely eat. Most of the time, he just sat by the stained glass window staring out toward the graves. I asked him once what he was looking at. He said, "They talk more at night." I laughed a little, thinking he was joking, but he didn't smile back. His eyes were bloodshot and he looked like he hadn't slept. That was when the strange things started. The first was the lights. The chapel didn't have working electricity anymore. We only used it for occasional ceremonies, but sometimes when I drove past the cemetery late at night, I'd see a faint glow flickering through the window. Like candlelight, but off somehow. Too bright, too steady. Then there were the sounds. At first I blamed the wind through the trees, but it was more than that. Whispers. Footsteps on gravel when nobody was there. One morning I came in and found all the hymn books stacked in a perfect spiral on the floor. Jonah swore he hadn't done it, and honestly I believed him. The pastor eventually noticed the boy and asked me about him. We tried to get help. Called a local shelter, even the police, but by the time they came, Jonah was gone. Just vanished. His sleeping bag and things were still there, folded neatly. The chapel door was locked from the inside. A week passed before I saw him again. It was early morning, gray and cold. I was trimming the overgrown grass near the far end of the cemetery when I noticed something that didn't belong. A small figure sitting cross-legged between two headstones. Jonah. He looked worse than before, filthy, hollow-eyed. His lips were moving like he was whispering to someone. I walked closer, and that's when I saw who he was sitting with. There was nobody there. Just an open patch of soil where an old grave had partially caved in from the rain. I called out his name, and he turned to look at me with this strange half-smile. "It's okay," he said softly. "They said I can stay now." Before I could respond, he stood up and walked toward the chapel. I followed, maybe 20 feet behind. He went inside and closed the door. When I reached it less than a minute later, the chapel was empty. No Jonah. No sound. Nothing. The only thing left was his sleeping bag folded perfectly on the pew and his footprints leading across the dusty wooden floor toward the back door that opened into the cemetery. They stopped right at the threshold. No footprints outside. No sign of him. We searched for days. The pastor called the police again, even had a few volunteers dig around some of the older graves. Just to be sure, nothing. Then a week later, one of the grave diggers, an old guy named Ralph, found something strange. He was working near that same collapsed grave Jonah had been sitting beside. The soil there was darker, softer. He said when his shovel hit something, he thought it was a root, until he saw it was fabric, a piece of blue nylon like from a sleeping bag. They stopped digging after that. The pastor didn't want to disturb the graves any further. Months went by. The police wrote it off as a runaway. I kept volunteering, but I started avoiding the chapel. I don't know why. It just felt wrong. Then one night around Christmas, I forgot my thermos inside after closing up. I went back with a flashlight. The chapel was freezing cold, and as soon as I stepped in, I heard breathing. Slow and steady, coming from the corner where Jonah used to sleep. I turned the light that way, and for a split second, I swear I saw someone lying there inside a sleeping bag. The same blue one. But when I blinked, it was gone. The bag, the shape, everything, just cold air and dust. I didn't tell anyone. I stopped volunteering after that. Sometimes when I drive past the cemetery on foggy mornings, I still glance toward the chapel. And sometimes I see a dim glow inside. People say it's just moisture reflecting light or kids sneaking in to scare themselves. But I know what I saw. The boy who slept among the graves never left. He just found a place that would finally keep him. And every now and then, when the fog is thick enough, you can see his footprints appear in the dew, leading toward that same empty grave. And stopping there. I used to work construction in upstate New York, mostly on cemetery restorations and small demolition jobs. My name's Ryan, and I'm one of those guys who never really believed in ghosts or curses or any of that. That changed in the summer of 2021, when our crew was hired to stabilize a section of old graves in Willow Pines Cemetery, a place that, even before that job, gave me a weird feeling every time I drove past it. Willow Pines sits on the outskirts of Fairvale, a quiet little town off Route 28. It's small, fenced in with rusting iron, and bordered by a thick stretch of pines that block out most of the sunlight. The town stopped burying people there in the 1940s. Most of the headstones lean at odd angles, names worn away by time. Locals told stories about it being built on old ground, though nobody could tell me what that actually meant. Our foreman, Jim, had taken the contract because the city wanted to put in drainage lines near the back of the property. A few of the older graves had sunken badly, so the plan was to dig, reinforce the soil, and set concrete footers beneath the worst areas. There were 5 of us working that week. Me, Jim, a guy named Mason, and 2 part-timers from the local union, Nate and Carlos. The first 2 days were uneventful. Just hot, dirty labor under a smothering blanket of humidity. Then, on Wednesday morning, Mason hit something underground while trenching behind the cemetery's chapel. He thought it was an old pipe at first, but when we cleared away the soil, it turned out to be the corner of a large stone slab, smooth, carved and too well cut to be natural. We uncovered more of it, and by mid-afternoon we realized it wasn't just a slab. It was a sealed entrance, like a door set into the ground. There were faint markings along the edge, half worn away but still visible in places. None of us could read them, but they didn't look like any lettering I'd ever seen. Jim called the city inspector, who told us to halt digging until morning. But after everyone else packed up, Mason hung around. He was the kind of guy who couldn't leave something alone once it got under his skin. Around 7 p.m., I was walking back to my truck when I saw his light still flickering near the back fence. He waved me over. The slab had been lifted halfway out using a jack and some steel rods. Underneath there was a hollow space, a dark gap leading down into blackness. Mason grinned and said, "Bet you $20 it's a bootlegger's tunnel." I told him he was an idiot, but he'd already unclipped his walkie-talkie from his vest and handed it to me. "Just keep me on," he said. "I'm going to take a peek." I still remember that moment. The smell of damp earth, the sound of cicadas buzzing, the faint chill coming up from the hole. He switched on his flashlight and lowered himself inside. The air was thick with silence after that. I listened through the walkie, hearing his boots scrape against the stone steps. "Then, man, it opens up down here. Holy crap, this is old." He paused. "There's coffins, like stone coffins, a whole row of them. I thought he was screwing with me, but something in his tone made my stomach twist. It wasn't excitement anymore, it was unease. "One of them's open," he said after a few seconds. The lids cracked. Then a sound came through the radio that didn't belong. A long, low hiss. Not static, but something deeper, like air being released from a pressurized pipe. Mason coughed and said it smelled metallic, like pennies and rot. Then he said, "Hold on. There's writing on the wall." "I can't." The walkie crackled sharply, followed by a burst of feedback that made me yank it away from my ear. When it cleared, I heard something faint behind his voice. Whispering, maybe? Dozens of overlapping tones, too quick to make out words. Mason's voice came back, louder this time. "Jim, Ryan, I think there's someone down here." He sounded close to panicking. I shouted into the radio for him to come back up, but all I got in return was breathing. Heavy, strained breathing. Then the sound of stone scraping, like something shifting against the floor. "It's moving." A sharp clang echoed through the radio, then a distant thud. After that, silence. I ran back to the opening, yelling his name, shining my light down into the hole. All I saw was darkness. The beam didn't hit bottom. No movement, no reply. I tried calling again, but the radio only spat back faint static. By the time I got Jim and the others, it was full dark. We searched with our flashlights, even tied a rope to one of the rods and dropped it in. It hit solid ground about 15 feet down. Jim climbed in halfway before pulling himself back out, pale and shaking. "There's no sign of him," he said quietly. "Just coffins and water." We called the sheriff, who showed up with a small team just after midnight. They cordoned off the area, set up floodlights, and lowered a camera into the hole. The feed they got was short. The equipment cut out after about 30 seconds. But in that footage, you can see the stone floor half flooded, and in the corner, something that looks like a human shape lying on its side. When they sent a team down the next morning, the crypt was empty. No sign of Mason, no footprints, no rope. Just murky water and a foul smell like burnt copper. The sheriff shut down the site and told us to stay quiet until the investigation was over. A week later, we were all called back in to collect our tools. The slab had been resealed with concrete and fenced off with warning tape. They never found Mason's body. Officially, he was listed as missing, presumed dead. But here's the part I haven't told anyone except one person. 2 nights after it happened, I was at home when my walkie-talkie, the same one Mason had taken with him, suddenly powered on by itself. It wasn't even near a charger, just sitting on my workbench. At first I heard static, then faintly a voice came through. His voice, "Ryan, don't open it again." Then a wet choking sound followed by something else, like the sound of dozens of whispers blending into one long, drawn-out moan. The transmission ended after that. The radio hasn't turned on since. I quit the job a few days later and moved out of Fairvale for good. But sometimes when the wind blows through pine trees at night, I swear I can still hear that same whispering sound. And last week, when I passed through town for gas, I saw that the fence around Willow Pines had been cut open again. Fresh footprints in the dirt. Someone else found that slab, and I don't think it likes being disturbed.